that context, I'm talking about the presentation. That context is very important when it comes to talking about the evolution of music. But why do you think that oftentimes when black people speak about Atlanta, the city's depicted like it's Wakanda and nothing goes wrong, and all the black people are rich, and though it's historically one of the most segregated cities with a huge wealth gap.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the first thing I'll say is you kind of need a Wakanda.
Yeah.
Sometimes you just don't want to think of, is there not a space for reprieve,
Mm.
right? Uh, and I will acknowledge that uh, those statistics, they're true, but again, it's also true that Atlanta has a very old black middle class, right? It's
Yeah.
and has had black leadership pretty consistently for a very long time. So it's all about kind of, I think, the way that people are kind of applying this perspective. How do we handle Atlanta not as a reality but as a symbol? And so for some folks, emphasizing the fact that there are um, you know, so many black owned businesses in Atlanta that you can be, driving down 75, 85 and see, a billboard for three girls and a needle, and listen to an insurance commercial on the radio that was made by Pastor Troy. That
Mm.
means something.
Yeah.
you know, it means something, but the worry that I kind of get into with some of that rhetoric is that if we focus on that without acknowledging the other side, right, then
The other
those
side as far as the poverty or the wealth.
the poverty,
Yeah.
right, or the wealth gap, or these larger, like macro patterns, right? If we don't acknowledge that, then we kind of fall into this trap of um, validating the idea that everything has already been fixed, right? You don't need to do more work. And it's a seductive trap because everybody wants to not be nobody wants to still be living in the shadow of enslavement.
Yeah.
Why would people want that? But uh but I'd say that people just kind of spend that with a bit of Wakanda has to be somewhere.
Yeah.
Can it be in Atlanta? Can we expand on the things that are going right there in a way that gives us a sense of belonging and home, and not having to, because it definitely can't be Wakanda. Stone Mountain is there. It is the Confederate Black, Mount Rushmore, is thriving down there. And even that, some black neighborhoods. So,
Yeah.
it's complicated,
A lot of
right?
a lot of a lot
But
of black people from New York moved to Stone Mountain.
yeah, and I get it. It's a nice neighborhood. I grew up like walking up and down Stone Mountain. Didn't really think about who was carved on the side or why, So so yeah, yeah, that's just where I put that. It's beautiful to acknowledge all of the amazing things that have happened in Atlanta and other places. Um, but do not fall into the trap of focusing on what's good so that you can ignore what, the work that still needs to be done.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, and it's like I said, it's that too, but it's not just that. If it were just the words without the music, it would be doing something different.
Hmm.
And I think Crunk is a good case study because it forces you to just confront the sound and the structure and the repetition. But a lot of those elements that I talk about in the book are present to some degree in lots of different types of songs. And we could also talk about there were proximal things happening, like we could talk about crumping on the West Coast,
Yeah.
um, or again, I bring up bounce, something that's happening in the projects in New Orleans, right? Which blew up in its own way. And, as New Orleans became more central on the national hip hop scene. But, all of these things there's always some sort of local, like, this is how we get down. This is how we get loose. This is how you know, this is why we leave the club sweating and tired. And, connecting to that means something for understanding, the people who are in the space and the way that they are relating to and using music.
Hmm. I want to touch on bass music, right? Because a lot of people know crunk, people know trap music, but a lot of people don't really know bass, which is almost like, in a sense, like some indigenous hip hop, as far as Atlanta and Miami, where
Mm.
where it started. How does Atlanta bass music turn into crunk?
Hmm. Yeah, what's interesting is a lot of the elements from crunk are actually present in bass in a way. Like they had that space of like chanting. That was present in bass. That was happening in Atlanta. Actually, Lil Jon gets his start kind of as a DJ who's really doing a lot of bass music.
Yeah.
DJ and producer who's doing bass music. Uh, I I say that the shift into crunk, um, number one, I can't stress enough the significance of the aesthetic impact of the Miami scene, right? Because Miami at the time, especially like 3 6 Mafia, they are dealing with like they're using samples and references from horror music. They're
You mean
playing
Memphis?
with, huh?
You mean Memphis?
Memphis? Yeah.
You said Miami.
I said Miami?
Yeah.
Yeah, I meant Memphis. Sorry. No, Miami was bright and sunny.
Yeah.
Yeah. Apologies to Memphis and Miami. But yeah, Memphis was dealing with some darker sounds. They were doing something kind of different with their music, their party music, and I think a lot of artists found inspiration with that. But sometimes the question of theft kind of comes in.
Yeah.
Uh, I don't necessarily see it as that because Atlanta bass and Atlanta hip hop broadly, it was there were a lot of people who were kind of going through Atlanta, right? Traveling through performing through. And these places are close enough to where DJs from all of these areas might, go through Atlanta, yeah, call myself, for this or that reason, or go through any of these. So I really see it as kind of a synthesis of people who are traveling throughout the South, who kind of fed into what would be Atlanta's signatures, sound for hip hop in the late 90s and going forward. Um, and another thing that I discuss in the book that I think is important in talking about this transition is yeeking. So yeeking is a dance style that is native to Atlanta. It started in the roller rinks with people doing the skate crews. Which, by the way, that's another area where academia has been a little slow. I haven't
Mm.
seen much work um, on coordinated skate dancing in Black communities, even though I see that happening in most big Black communities where there's a roller rink. You have folks that are doing coordinated dances
Yep.
on the skates. Like that's just it's so familiar. But Yeeking kind of grows out of that. It's people who took those. those dance moves, including the coordination, and turned it into um, a dance style that started out just kind of in the like on the floor in the roller rinks and then turned into its own thing. And I'm bringing them up because a lot of folks on the Yeek scene, they created music that fit their movements,
Mm-hmm.
right? They they took the, this was back in the 80s when it first starts. They took the records that they had access to, hip hop records, bass records from Miami. They sped them up because they're moving faster. They don't have skates on anymore. They played with the timbre, they played with the production, they created new songs, and created local celebrities like Kilo Ali, Mel, Sweet Melody Patrick, DJ Taz. And that became a driving force for just kind of the sound of Atlanta party music. Like that was Atlanta bass.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and, part of what distinguishes it from, the very similar sounding, but still very different Miami bass. Um, so I'm also bringing this up because the yeeking dance style, it's very precise, it's very coordinated. Even when it's semi improvised, you have like every dance move has a name. You have a leader who calls out the name so that the crew can kind of stay in sync. That's one approach to embodiment in space, right? That's one kind of dancing. Crunk had a whole different thing, where people are like kind of in a huddled mass and,
Yeah.
jumping around. And I kind of see that as a potential shift from, if we're talking about a cipher where folks are doing a dance off, a shift from focusing on the people in the middle to the people on the outside. Like, how do we get everybody activated, with their full force? And that was another shift, another reason why we had the shift from Atlanta bass to crunk.
Mm-hmm.
But it all kind of like all of those elements come together. And like I said, the kind of blatant attack on Black youth party culture and Black youth recreational spaces, it kind of, it gave folks something to be, to want to jump and yell and like let it all out about,
True.
you know. So yeah, that's part of that through line.
Mm-hmm. So I was a kid. I was coming of age during the early aughts when crunk was becoming commercially viable. And on the outside looking in, with my I'm from New York, or with my northeastern ignorance, it always seemed like Lil Jon invented the music and he had a monopoly on the music because even the other artists you would say that were crunk artists like the Yin Yang Twins, they were associated with him. So what is it about Lil Jon that made him the face of crunk?
Um, so part of it is I think it's hard to say. It potentially could have been somebody else. Because there were other artists who
Yeah.
were experimenting with this. I do think Lil Jon, because he gets his start, kind of like I said, he's DJing in the bass era, in the '90s. He's producing. He's in network with folks on the bass scene like Bo Hagen. I think he gets a shout from uh, Playa Poncho and LA Snow on What's Up, What's Up. You know, so he's just somebody who was in the mix, and he had, I think, the vision to put together these different elements. Because listening through Lil Jon's catalog, he actually experimented with a lot of different styles in hip hop party music. I've definitely heard some Lil Jon stuff that's like, oh, this is kind of go go,
Mm,
or this is more like it's he was really kind of synthesizing it. And I think part of the story is that he was somebody who was just kind of focused in on creating a dynamic party environment using all these different elements. If I so how like Anita Baker decided to focus on I'm just going to make smooth music,
yep.
and she became kind of like the her own kind of like adult contemporary face. I'm not going to give you a fast track on the song anymore. We're all staying in this lane. Well,
Yeah.
John did that with Crunk. You
Hmm.
know, he was like, I'm gonna kind of master this type of dynamic in my music, and he put in a lot of hard work. I think that's also another thing because he was the face of kind of a party culture. You kind of miss the fact that he was
Grinding.
working and grinding hard, and also he was very thoughtful and very intentional in his marketing of Crunk. So he didn't invent it, but nobody marketed Crunk like Lil Jon, and that can't be ignored. Like that is what built this narrative of Crunk is kind of a Lil Jon thing. Um, the way that I discuss Crunk in my work and in my book, I like to think of it more of like a Crunk trajectory, right? There, before the subgenre of Crunk, there were lots of styles of music that were made to get you crunk, right? To get you your energy up, to get your body moving. Um, and from that perspective, what we get from Lil Jon, what we get from the subgenre of crunk is just, it's a blip on a timeline,
Hmm.
or it's a moment on a timeline, as opposed to it's something that was created whole cloth and it's decontextualized. Um, so that's what I'd say. Lil Jon, he put in the work to become the face of Crunk. He was somebody who had a lot of production knowledge of different styles of
Yeah.
Southern hip hop party music, and he synthesized a lot of it together, including with, like I said, with Miami and Memphis styles. And he was uh, in those spaces, where he's already kind of in network with people who are making Atlanta hip hop.
Yeah. Yeah. I wasn't really privy to what Lil Jon was really doing, like to blow up. I didn't really know his trajectory until I watched the Freaknik documentary on Hulu,
Mm.
and I learned how much work he was putting in, and it really just made me have a newfound respect for him because he really was a pioneer. He wasn't the first, but he was the first to see that this could be something that could make us rich.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's also kind of I think it's a big thing with a lot of this kind of local party music because you have people who are making it, but not necessarily positioned in the best way to capitalize off of it.
Yeah,
And there are pros and cons, with that. Some people think that before you get to mass marketing, that's when it's really pure. And then you also have folks who is like, well, these are artists. Do they not deserve to, feed themselves and
yeah,
secure themselves off of their art? Um, but yeah, I'll say absolutely, Lil Jon had a vision for creating a crunk empire. That's what he did, and he, as an extension of his investment in crunk as an idea, and as kind of an aesthetic approach to making music. He There was a moment where it's like you can't go an hour on the radio
for
without hearing
sure.
Lil Jon
It
at
didn't
some
matter
point.
what part of the country you were in.
Right.
Uh,
Right. So he earned it. He put it in the work.
do you think that him growing up like upper middle class kind of helped him have that that vision to know that there's more?
I never thought about that. What's wild is usually the question I encounter is, does Lil Jon growing up upper middle class have an impact on his authenticity? Because we
Mm,
often associate hip hop with poor and working class experiences.
yeah.
Um, that doesn't necessarily go for, because, if we're talking about music that is about how you are occupying space, some of the things about what's outside of that space fall away a little bit. It's nobody's gonna say Lil Jon is less crunk because he grew up
Yeah,
in a I don't know. I don't know how Lil Jon grew up. McMansion, whatever.
yeah,
Um, uh, yeah, I don't know. That's an interesting perspective. I don't have an answer for that. But I think that it's worth kind of looking into because we can't pretend that there's not a passive kind of education for folks who grew up with privilege.
hmm
They get all of these cues from the people around them about how to how to manage money, how to invest, how to um, move, how to move in the world in a way that expands your wealth.
yeah,
Um, I can't deny that possibility. And there's also, the fact that growing up with class privilege put him in a position to where he could throw those house parties,
yep.
and have the equipment and have maybe even the time to do certain things.
Have a basement
Um,
to
you know,
to own your craft.
right. So that's part of the story. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I think that's a really interesting question. I'm gonna give it some thought.
Yeah. No, I would love to see your perspective on that. I didn't know that he grew up upper middle class until I watched the Freaknik documentary. And I mean it didn't make me look at him any differently, like he was a culture vulture, or an outsider or anything. Like he is from Atlanta. He Atlanta's not like a super big city, so the proximity to the hood where the music is thriving is I mean, I'm sure you're pretty close to it. You're going to school. If you're going to public school, you're going to school with people from these communities.
Yeah, Atlanta's a really unique kind of space in the South. It was called the Black Mecca for a reason. It's had a thriving Black middle class for a very long time,
Hmm.
and it has also had a very vibrant poor working class Black,
Yeah,
Black citizenry. So if we are talking about, so there's always been like a really complicated discussion around class and race at the same time in a place like Atlanta. Um, I would also say that when it came to looking at things like Freaknik, if we're on it, all those things kind of get collapsed in, right? Because we're talking about spring breakers who are, for the ones who were, college students, most of them are attending HBCUs,
yeah,
and if nothing else, HBCUs have investments in prestige and yeah, like they're not the spaces where you know you kind of just let it all hang out and don't care about yourself and
yeah,
you can be sloppy, right? There's a real investment in or a lot of them were founded with the politics of uplift.
yeah.
How could they not be, right? And
Booker T. Washington kind of politics.
right, and which is, it's a valid philosophical navigation of the type of oppressive regimes that they're facing, right? Um, so all of that kind of gets collapsed when folks are attacking Freaknik. On top of just kind of collapsing, you know, because it didn't really matter um, the class background of these young Black people. It didn't really matter whether or not they were in college. It didn't really matter. Yeah, they were all kind of lumped in together um, as being um, a certain type of problem to the city, right? So, in some way, I bring this up because in some ways there are instances, times where the class discussion is very necessary. Especially if we talk about um, investment and kind of like assimilationist philosophy. You know, But then there are times when, the conversation is, well, Black folks, regardless of class background, regardless of presentation of self, are kind of bound to this history of being, imagined as a racial caste.
Yeah.
And yeah, I feel like I'm taking a little bit of a tangent, but but it's true. Like it's both of those things kind of at once, and it's to something else you brought up. All of these spaces are kind of, I mean, because Atlanta has a unique history in terms of spatial segregation, right? In the mid 20th century, Atlanta had the motto, "It's the city too busy to hate,"
Yeah.
right? Because you had black and white folks working together, but on the whole, black and white folks were not living together.
Yep.
And that creates its own patterns of and we talked about white, you brought up white flight, but it brings up its own patterns of class stratification within, black areas. Um, so these, let's say, wealthy black communities and poor and working class black communities are sometimes uh, very close. Sometimes they kind of cross over each other in interesting ways. Um, I know that from my own like high school experience, the class stratification was really wild. Like you would have students that were in, homes that were hundreds of thousands of dollars, and you had students who were in, uh, you know, um, in apartments that were government subsidized.
Yeah.
All kind of mixed in. So, you know, I don't know if that boils down to how we place a little John in this conversation,
I think everything's
but
connected.
yeah, it's all connected, and I think it also kind of, again, it sparks up in those various moments, historically in the city of New York, especially, talking about something like the Atlanta child murders, right? That uh, that really had both race and class implications.
Yeah.
But even though the people who are poor and working class were the most vulnerable, it really reverberated uh, through the entirety of Atlanta's Black citizenry.
Yeah.
Um, and it's wild to me the way that it is. It's not as remembered as I believe it should be.
Hmm. My last point in this, realm of the conversation, and it just came to me, of course, people who have less have innovated so much and contributed to the world, um, out of just their lack of. But historically, you look at a genre like hip hop. Hip hop wouldn't be what it is today as far as popularity if the middle class and the upper middle class weren't its biggest consumers. And I think not only does that apply to the white kids who were buying hip hop and buying tickets to shows, but also the growing black middle class post the segregation act. And when you think about college, college is really a privilege of the middle class. You know, um, the average person can't get into well, the average person could could probably get into college but can't afford
Right. You can't just
college.
write a check to be like, here's tuition.
Yeah, so um, so going back to Freaknik, I'm sure a large percentage of students driving down to Atlanta uh, during Freaknik were privileged black kids. I mean, I'm looking at a lot of these cars that they were driving down there. It's like, how do you have a car with a sound system, in your college age? A sound system,
Mhm.
that's like $3,000 to put a sound system in a car, you know?
Right. Um, Also camcorders,
Exactly.
which is there's a lot of footage about Freaknik because it was taken by people who were there. But like when you think about who has, the space, the energy, the investment to get a camcorder in the '90s and like bring it with them to Freaknik, yeah. So Freaknik is one of a bunch of Black youth vacationing events that popped up in the '80s. And something I talk about in the book a little bit, and I bet you won't get crunk, is that this was really the earliest that could have happened. Because there is a boom in the Black middle class that kind of leads into that space. So, um, to backtrack a little bit, or to go back a little bit on the timeline, mass youth vacationing really kicks off after World War II. That's when the middle class kind of expands and folks kind of extend their childhoods in a certain way. So, they grew up middle class, they grew up doing things like going camping. And then as they transition into being young adults, they continue things like that, going to the beach just to have fun for a week or a weekend. And that really didn't happen like that, not on a grand scale before, but we don't see that happening for Black folks until the 1980s. And we get Freaknik, we get Orange Crush, we get Greek Week and Virginia Beach. Like a bunch of them pop up, and all of them were reacted to with hostility. Freaknik was probably the biggest one, but all of these things, but they are a direct outgrowth of an increase in students going to college, Black students going to college, an increase in Black students having um, the type of financial freedom and excess income to
Hmm.
be able to just invest in something like a week long vacation in another place for the
Yeah.
purposes of having fun.
Yep.
Um, you have uh, just the money it costs to do all of those things,
Hmm.
right? So not just make the space in your schedule, but to actually be there and spend there, right? So you know, Freaknik and all of those others, they came with a certain type of investment in leisure time that, and I connect this phenomenon, right? These bad reactions to Black youth leisure um, events to the concept of moral panic, right? Before anything, folks had this sense of Black people are, these young Black people are here and they're just in the street for what? That tension of like, nobody called you here. Why are you here? Right. And uh, in many ways, they're reacting to that. Right. And not all of the other ways. Atlanta handled much larger events, right, with much better sort of humanity, with much more consideration than they did Freaknik. But yeah, it is absolutely an outgrowth of the expansion of the Black middle class. Another thing I will kind of note, and since we brought up the Freaknik documentary, it's mostly told from the perspectives of people who organized it.
True.
They had their own perspectives. I think they interview one attendee, uh, and it's just so interesting to have the attendees are represented in the images and in the footage, but they're not really voicing all of the things that went down, like why they felt like Freaknik was something to attend. I always assumed that I would go to Freaknik when I was older. I have an older sister; she went to Freaknik. I just thought that's what you did. um, but while I was watching the documentary, I was talking with my sister and I was asking her, what it was like. And she was like, it was so much fun. And then sometimes it was so scary.
Yeah.
And I think just the depth of that, You know, it's important to acknowledge, right? It's we maybe miss a little bit of an important voice in not having more Freaknik attendees be a part of the documentary. Of course,
I agree.
maybe everybody just kind of hiding their face, like, "Nah, I wasn't down there doing that on that car." Yeah,
Oh man, yeah, a lot of moms, maybe even grandmas, was down there doing some, had the
yeah.
with them booty shorts, was out there. Uh,
It's the South. It's hot.
speaking of class, you did a really good job at telling the sociological history of Atlanta as far as segregation and urban planning goes, because that context, I'm talking about the presentation, that context is very important when it comes to talking about the evolution of music. But why do you think that oftentimes when black people speak about Atlanta, the city's depicted like it's Wakanda and nothing goes wrong, and all the black people are rich, and though it's historically one of the most segregated cities with a huge wealth gap?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the first thing I'll say is you kind of need a Wakanda.
Yeah.
Sometimes you just don't want to think of, is there not a space for reprieve,
Mm.
right? Uh, and I will acknowledge that uh, those statistics, they're true, but again, it's also true that Atlanta has a very old black middle class, right? It's
Yeah.
and has had black leadership pretty consistently for a very long time. So it's all about kind of, I think, the way that people are kind of applying this perspective. How do we handle Atlanta not as a reality but as a symbol? And so for some folks, emphasizing the fact that there are um, you know, so many black owned businesses in Atlanta that you can be, driving down 75, 85 and see, a billboard for three girls and a needle, and listen to an insurance commercial on the radio that was made by Pastor Troy. That
Mm.
means something.
Yeah.
you know, it means something, but the worry that I kind of get into with some of that rhetoric is that if we focus on that without acknowledging the other side, right, then
The other
those
side, as far as the poverty or the wealth.
the poverty,
Yeah.
right, or the wealth gap, or these larger, like macro patterns, right? If we don't acknowledge that, then we kind of fall into this trap of um, validating the idea that everything has already been fixed, right? You don't need to do more work. And it's a seductive trap because everybody wants to not be nobody wants to still be living in the shadow of enslavement.
Yeah.
Why would people want that? But uh but I'd say that people just kind of spin that with a bit of Wakanda has to be somewhere.
Yeah.
Can it be in Atlanta? Can we expand on the things that are going right there in a way that gives us a sense of belonging and home, and not having to, because it definitely can't be Wakanda. Stone Mountain is there. It is the Confederate Black, Mount Rushmore, is thriving down there. And even that, some black neighborhoods. So,
Yeah.
it's complicated,
A lot of
right?
a lot of a lot
But
of black people from New York moved to Stone Mountain.
yeah, and I get it's a nice neighborhood. I grew up like walking up and down Stone Mountain. Didn't really think about who was carved on the side or why, So it's so yeah, yeah, that's just where I put that. It's beautiful to acknowledge all of the amazing things that have happened in Atlanta and other places. Um, but do not fall into the trap of focusing on what's good so that you can ignore what, the work that still needs to be done.
Exactly. And I think just to add to that, when people see black capitalism, they they I feel like they think it's a little different than white capitalism, but
Man,
it's not.
I want I once went to a documentary screening and it was about black economics. I don't remember the name of the documentary, but at the end of it, I was like, yeah, that's just trickle down economics. Like y'all said nothing about, like y'all just blaming poor people for it's the same thing. So yeah, it's again, it's another seductive idea, the idea that um there is an easy and straightforward way to circumvent or completely negate, histories of systemic oppression, presences of systemic oppression. But, we can't fall into that trap. It's capitalism is not made to save everybody,
Yeah,
as a structure. And we have to be aware of that, and we also have to be aware of, again, like I said, there are a lot of really nice feelings. Like I still like it still makes me smile if I see like, oh, black owned business that's thriving is out there doing well in the world. But I also understand that um, the reason why it makes me uniquely happy is I understand that there is a whole system of things that work against that reality. And I also understand that it exists within a world where all of those other things that prevent it actually are preventing other people from having, secure and thriving lives. Right. So, yeah.
yeah, yeah. Um, but still, it's Atlanta's a great symbol for what Black people can achieve. And, like you mentioned, there's been a thriving Black middle class for a long time. So I still think you're right. We do need some kind of reprieve as far as aspirations, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. There's Kevin Quashie has a book called Black Aliveness. And it's a beautifully poetic book. And at one moment, he talks about, addressing the question of where he locates Black aliveness. And he describes um, finding the doll of an enslaved child, right? And I think it was something that was very early in enslavement. And he points to that um, to note that even in uh, something as pressing and dire and omnipresent as enslavement, somebody was encouraging a child to imagine something different than the circumstances that they're currently in. So that sort of investment in imagination, that investment um, in something beautiful, and something loving, and something nurturing, that in itself does a lot of work. I mean, it's not the only work. Again, we can't get caught on the on the focus of it all, but it kind of gives that spark, right, where we are not reduced um, to machines,
Yeah,
kind of, you know, navigating our own oppression. There, and that also gets back to like Crunk, right? Like just having a moment to experientially just kind of be full voice, to let go, to be kind of fully into something, right? Those moments are a spark, to our own humanity, and that is so necessary. We can talk about uh, the need for balance, right? Because it can't be all that all the time,
Hmm.
which is probably why Lil Jon has a meditation album now. It can't be all crunk all the time. I think he has a couple actually, but it's also a significant part of the pie. Right. It's a significant part of how we understand ourselves, orient ourselves, and how we express, the depth of our humanity within the context of a world and a history that did not always see us as human.
Mm, yeah, and I want to get back to the music. Speaking of Lil Jon, with the homo. Speaking of Crunk, with the homogeneity of modern hip hop, do you think that you would be able to write this book, but instead of it being about Atlanta and Crunk, you just replace it with another recent hip hop subgenre from another city, or is it not possible because everyone is making their own version of a popular subgenre right now?
Hmm. Yeah, I think that there are some things that I could just translate, from one place to another, because every place kind of has its version of that. It's local sound. It's like blasting out of the cars at 3 a.m. Every place has that. There are some things that are very specific to Atlanta. Part of it is Atlanta's history, um, as being both this Black Mecca sort of city and also being in the South, and going through specific things, the Atlanta child murders, the Olympics, right? These things, and housing Freaknik, those things didn't happen everywhere.
Yeah.
Um, but in terms of like theoretically and kind of philosophically, it's my hope that this book speaks to more than just crunk, right? Uh, because there's so many types of music. And this even goes like beyond hip hop. There's so many types of music that kind of call people to express that catharsis by just kind of focusing on like it's it's music about activating your body and space among the people that you're with. Uh, Historically, we could think about, you know, um, some soul music was about that. The good old fashioned James Brown sweating out his perm soul
Hmm.
is, kind of, I'd say kind of in the same vein of people getting activated, getting on the floor. It's happening in juke joints. It's happening like in different places and in different times. Um, so that's my real hope for the book, that people in other places see at least some scaffolding that they can use
Yeah.
to discuss, what's happening kind of locally and translocally. Actually, one of my peers in ethnomusicology space, Jasmine Henry, at UPenn, she does some amazing work on like Jersey club music.
Okay.
And yeah, I mean, so many similarities, even though these are places that are very far apart. And honestly, I feel like there are reverberations with the original, like, kind of hip hop scene, because it was also very much about asserting your right to occupy space through graffiti, through breaking in different areas, and through the music, So this is something. So what I've written is like a very Atlanta thing, with implications for how people get down in other places, in other circumstances, and at other times.
All right. Yeah. I would definitely love to check that out.
I will say something that's kind of interesting to me. We are in new territory in terms of the place of, I mean, hip hop has always been technologically mediated. It was always about that kind of techno culture thing.
Yep.
But social media and the internet, that's a new monster. And the presence of AI and algorithms, that's new too.
Hmm.
Right. So I'm curious to see, you know, in a context where people are imagining, constructing themselves, not just in space, but also kind of an internet space and fragmenting through all of these different sorts of like apps and internet communities. I'm wondering what their version might be. I'm wondering
Mm.
if there's a proximal something there. Like maybe there will be, and maybe there won't. But
We
it's
kind of spoke about that
interesting.
earlier, though, right?
Yeah, yeah,
About
yeah.
yeah,
About the mobile. Yeah,
yeah.
but for me, like that's just something I'm kind of keeping an eye on because I'm fascinated because so much of what I wrote about and what so many ethnomusicologists in general. I mean, there are folks who focus on like social media as a cultural location, as a field site. Um, that's not kind of what I've done historically, so I'm like hanging back a little bit. But um, there are so many, potentially new dynamics. And as per usual, hip hop is kind of at the forefront
Yeah.
of playing with those things. That's why, we get AI generated BBL Drizzy, which gets turned into, you know, yeah. But that's fascinating. Like, creating something that sounds old, but it's new to then sample like it is old
Yeah.
to create something else new. Like there's some nuances there that didn't quite exist before. And that's exciting.
When you watch these sci-fi movies and shows from years ago, they never really touched on concepts of like how we would consume music in the future. So all of this is like
Mm,
actually very surprising to me. I would have never in my wildest dreams thought that there would be artificial intelligence songs. And
right.
I'm still processing it because it's strange to me. But I guess as a millennial, I'm kind of shifting into uh, damn near being a Gen X or baby boomer sometimes compared to the thoughts and taste of uh, Gen Z and Alpha now.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Folks who like really, really grew up with, I kind of grew up with the internet, but they grew up with the internet.
Yeah.
Like they were, that's fascinating. And something I haven't seen a lot of work about this, but I'm still fascinated by the FN Mecca thing. The AI rapper.
Oh, okay.
It turns out they were just stealing, well, not stealing. They had promised Kyle the Hooligan is a rapper from Florida uh, and like I think payment down the line. But if you remember the controversy, FN Mecca got signed, and then there's this whole thing about, well, if it's AI, who's getting paid?
Mm,
Oh, the owner of the program gets paid, not the person who's voicing them. And also, the owner of the program is kind of guiding whatever system because the idea was that AI was just making its own choices as the performer and in the images. Um, but that to me, it's hitting on some of those like really old school exploitation of black artistry
mm,
from like 1950s.
yeah.
A little, Big Mama Thornton's not the most known hound dog.
Yeah.
It's hitting on something like that. So the more things change, the more things stay the same. But
Exactly.
at the very least, all of it's like it's fascinating and new territory.
Yeah. Uh, I was watching your presentation and at the archive, and it had me thinking about we speaking about Atlanta so much. It had me thinking about Kendrick's last verse on "Not Like Us," and
Hmm.
he spoke about the nature of Drake's relationship with Atlanta. You have any related thoughts on that matter?
About Drake specifically?
No, about what he was saying in that last verse about Drake going to Atlanta to basically like be a colonizer and not a colleague.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And I also love that he placed it within the context of Atlanta as a black Mecca,
Yeah.
Atlanta, you know, why and how black people kind of migrated to Atlanta historically. Um uh what do I want to say about this? Like this is I I think that there's something. Well, I'll start by saying, Atlanta is a city that has had, a music industry infrastructure for a time, even before it was really investing in hip hop. Um, so there is a fount of creativity happening there. Um, and over the past 25 years, Atlanta has been kind of seen as a space where people can kind of get some of that cachet.
Yeah.
You know, and I kind of agree. There are lots of artists. Well, yeah, not attacking Drake. I mean, I guess I could, but there are a lot of it's to the point where traveling to or through Atlanta with the idea of sharpening your skills as an artist and building your career on the connections that you have there, it's a viable path. Um, Actually, I mentioned before, like way early in the interview, like that's what Janelle Monáe was doing. She was from Kansas City, but she was down there kind of with Outkast and them,
Yep.
and like hanging out in Atlanta. Not hanging out, but working in Atlanta to kind of blow up. So um, it also kind of brings to mind, again, all of the good reasons, folks go to Atlanta. There is that other read of, the beginning of those verses, that imply that for all of the benefits of going to a place like Atlanta historically, there's also been the ongoing exploitation. Not everybody who travels to or through Atlanta is doing so with the purest of
Yeah.
intentions. Not everybody is trying to invest in the thriving of a space, um, which is again just riffing off of what Kendrick Lamar said. I'll also there are other cities that are getting a little bit of that reputation or that have that reputation a bit in the South. At least within hip hop space, I'm thinking of New Orleans.
Hmm.
And, Drake also has a bounce record. So there's that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I I had so many conversations about this whole battle. I mean, it's great, and you know, anyway, I think it's like
Yeah. Yeah.
it's just like the greatest rap battle of all time to me. But it it really provokes so many different thoughts, intellectually about conversations about colonization and authenticity and exploitation. And it's just interesting that it's someone who's black critiquing another black person about doing those things, which makes it even more interesting. It adds another layer.
Yeah. Actually, there's a book, uh, Monique Taylor's Harlem Between Heaven and Hell. Um, and it's about gentrification, the gentrification of Harlem, but she focuses on it's the gentrification kind of starts with wealthy black folks kind of renovating or changing the space,
Mm.
that made it possible for, somebody like Whole Foods to want to come in and,
Yeah,
set up on 125th Street. It's so that's, bringing it back to class. It's not all kind of easily collapsible.
yeah,
You know, one of the things that Taylor talks about is because Harlem is so coded, as a space of historical blackness, people weren't necessarily paying attention when there were black folks coming in who were making the space hostile to poor and working class black folks. It just felt like, Harlem is Harlem. Um, but then that was kind of the transition to uh, more. visible, legible, gentrification moves that happened there a little later on. Um, so it's an interesting book. It's an interesting conversation. Again, the reminder that um, we can't be so ready to collapse race and class together. We have to be able to tease through the nuances of both elements and see how they're kind of intertwining.
Yeah. So what's next for you?
What's next? That's a wild question for me. um, well, in my time as a Nasir Jones hip hop fellow, I completed my book manuscript. And
Congrats.
so, thank you. And so, the thing I'm working on now is just moving that through the publication process. Should be forthcoming soon. Um, Getting back to teaching, it was wild to take a break. I love getting back to the students and connecting with them and the work that they're doing. And continuing, there's more work I want to do on yeeking.
Okay.
For something that's been around for 40 years, hardly documented. Y'all can expect more work from about that. And something I have kind of on the back burner a little bit, like something I've been thinking about, is getting into contemporary blues.
Okay.
Uh, Yeah, yeah. I mean, because there's some interesting parallels between like what I'm talking about in terms of getting crunk and the current like blues joint,
Yeah.
thing, which has its own like hip hop adjacent work. So again, something I'm just kind of thinking about. Not quite there yet, but don't be surprised if I'm talking about somebody who's flowing in the backwoods of Mississippi somewhere at some
Yeah.
point.
And
Yeah.
how that connects to like a current rapper.
Right. Right. Um, yeah. And it's also like we are well, in a hip hop inflected world. So again, going back to what Dochi said, anybody who doesn't see that, or anybody who thinks that hip hop hasn't kind of permeated all of our ways of knowing, being, thinking, and expressing, is doing so kind of out of willful denial,
Hmm.
and probably needs to get in touch with why that willful denial is so persistent.
Yeah. Yeah. I think
Yeah.
that's a great place to wrap it up. My last question for you, Dr. Holt. It's a question I ask all my guests. This podcast is named Words Matter. You have earned much acclaim and prestige because of words. Why do words matter to you?
Mm. Uh, so why words matter to me? The first thing that comes to mind is there are some times where you experience something, you think something, and words fail you. There are no words you can find to
Yeah.
express the thing that you're dealt with. But through that comes a space and a time to create the language that you need to express what you're doing or express what's significant to you. To me, that process of creating language, of creating something new to articulate an experience that used to be ineffable, that's to me why words matter. They spark, they lead us into and help us express something that that speaks true to our lived experiences.
Mm.
Yeah.
All right, man. Great answer. Thank you, Dr. Kevin C. Holt, for sitting down with me. Um, Interview was like 2 months in the making, but definitely well worth the wait. So yeah, man, thank you so much. It was a great conversation about not only, I mean, I didn't even have that many questions written down, but you like to share, and that's great, of course. You are a teacher, and you taught me some things, and I'm sure you have taught the people who will watch and listen to this episode a lot of things. And man, congrats on your book and being a fellow again this year, and congrats on just everything you've accomplished, and really taking how hip hop is perceived to the next level as far as it being respected.
Thank you, and thank you for this invitation to have this conversation here. This has been great. Hopefully, look forward to other conversations in the future. But yeah, you out there, you're doing good work, and I appreciate that.
All right, man. All right, words matter. Thank you.